Welcome to Talk HR UK with me, Simon Gear from Alexander Lloyd, the HR recruitment specialist for the southeast of the UK. So today, a whole new version of the podcast. If I give you a little bit of background before we embark, but you can see we have a panel. It's not just me plus one. So hello, everyone. Good morning. Thank you for joining me and us. So the background to this podcast really, this is part two. This is the sequel to a podcast Gavin and I recorded quite recently, which was really focusing on why culture and engagement and our approach to culture and engagement isn't working currently. So it's quite an interesting podcast. I think we had a great response. And what we did after, Gavin posed a number of interesting questions and points, we asked for your feedback, your responses and the questions you had around culture and engagement. And I'm pleased to say you responded. There are questions, and that's what today is all about. So we've assembled all the, and I say we, Gavin, I'll be honest, has done a lot of the heavy lifting and assembled all the questions into three main threads that Gavin, Ben and Imogen today are going to tackle. Strap yourselves in, get ready. Before we begin, I'm actually going to introduce all three of the panel to you so you know who they all are. So starting with Gavin Russell is the founder of Peppermoth, a culture and engagement consultancy, as well as the author of Transformation Time Bomb. How many times have I held this up, Gavin? A guidebook to change in the digital age. Gavin has been on the podcast. I think this is at least the third time, possibly the fourth. So a frequent guest. He speaks about how organizations and individuals can work better together to improve their collective performance. Gavin's also a specialist in design thinking, business experimentation and change management.
Hello.
Morning, sir. In the red corner, we have Ben Foulkes. Morning, Ben. Ben's
Morning, everyone.
Hi there. Ben is a business psychologist with 10 years experience working with leadership teams to unlock the brilliance of their people. He works with a number of organizations, including Hoxby, the School of Life, Imagine, formed by Paul Coleman, and most recently T-, to unlock the passion of people and make organizations a force for good in the world. No pressure, Imogen. You're third. Imogen Marsh is an HR director, an executive coach and board director, and most recently launched her new consultancy, Lemons Consulting Group. She has led many cultural change programs and talks to us about the new world of work, behavioral change, and the role of HR as cultural architects. So a crack team has been assembled today. My role, I was affectionately labelled Sandy Toxvig in our brief rehearsal, and it was a brief rehearsal, as you'll see, for this. So I'm here really to pose the questions to the panel and to then manage the dialogue afterwards. We are, of course, time-bound, so if we don't get to where we want to get for all three questions, we apologise in advance, but we'll do our best. And really kicking off your questions, and here they are. So question one, area one, which I'm going to pose to you first of all, Ben, and as we then move around. If HR focuses on upskilling leaders, does culture take care of itself? In fact, do we even need to intentionally define and shape a single organizational culture? Over to you.
Thanks, Simon. I think it's a really interesting question that we pose. And I think the premise behind it is, I want to say that upskilling leaders is incredibly important because of the unfortunate fact that people tend not to really do what you say or do what you ask them to. They tend to follow what you do. And so this plays a huge part in defining culture because behavior ripples out from leaders. And I did promise not to try and bring too much of the sort of science into this, but I would say this is what we have, what neuroscientists call mirror neurons, and they unconsciously fire when we see other people behaving in certain ways or showing emotions. This is what we get when we talk about a felt experience. This is the sort of neuroscientist base of that shared experience. So when we talk about upskilling leaders, I would talk about that in terms of developing leaders' self-awareness of the impact that they have on other people and the huge potential ripple effect they can have across an organization, and therefore in defining the culture of an organization. So yes, I think it's incredibly important. That being said, and not to try and predispose the arguments that we're going to hear, but I do believe also to an extent that we shape our buildings and then our buildings shape us. I think was that Churchill or something said that. You know, but so it's really important when we look at hiring, for instance, as maybe a role of HR or within an organization that's beyond just upskilling leaders, that the people that we hire are really critical. Airbnb, I believe, took around 12 months or something to make their first hire, because they just know that as soon as you make that one hire in development, that culture kind of spawns outwards. Like once you hire one person, they're going to hire probably quite similar people to them, and certainly, you know, the behavior ripples out. So you're going to define the culture through that. And it's also, and it's not just hiring, right? Like there are systems and processes and the ways that we build our organizational buildings that, you know, also help us essentially define behavior. So when I was at Accenture, you know, there were 6 values on the wall, and there was all these things that people talked about, the importance of collaboration and how they wanted the culture to be like this. But the truth was that when performance management came around, so every 6 months, it was the same story. We measured individual performance. You looked at the hard numbers like chargeability, your percentage of time spent on a client. You looked at sales, and ultimately that drove the individual contributor kind of behavior and that type of performance. You know, those people were promoted. Everything else, the people development side of things, the people writing thought leadership, doing great, important stuff, that was all put to the side, and it shaped how people behaved in that organization. So, you know, is it just about upskilling leaders? Not just, but it's certainly a place that I would look to start. Yeah.
Thanks, Ben. Gavin, your view. If HR focuses on upskilling leaders, does culture take care of itself?
So I've got 2 comments really about that. I think the first one is probably is culture's not actually just about employees. So if I take the question and think that if we're just focusing on leaders, we're looking at how leaders become better and how that ripples out within an organization. But culture is not just about what happens in your organization. So we know that culture has become a cornerstone of the commercial proposition. We know it's become key in connecting with all stakeholders. So if you're just focusing on leaders, I think you're missing some critical audiences. And those audiences, I'm going to kick off with the most obvious one, which is customers. We all know customer expectations have massively transformed over the last 10 or 15 years. You know, purpose, ethics, sustainability, customer centricity, innovation, digitalization. Customers have a whole new bar that we as organizations need to meet and reach. Culture has become that tangible manifestation of how they can see if we're behaving in line with what we're telling them that we're doing, right? So it becomes this very much a window, or your employees become a window of your shop front, if you like, to all of those consumers that are looking to potentially buy your products or stay buying your products. The other one is obviously stakeholders. So you've got shareholders in there, you've got maybe there are other investors, maybe it's suppliers, partners, contractors, and the communities they operate within. They are also really critical audiences that are shaped and influenced by culture. And I think, again, if we're just talking about leaders or focusing on upskilling leaders, how does that manifest when it comes to the supplier relationships you have, or the investor relationships you have, or the relationships you have with the communities you might operate within? So I think it's really crucial that you've got this coherent, convergent, consistent culture that enables you to connect with all of those different audiences in a really compelling way. The other bit I would say, and I'll get through this quickly because I know I'm overrunning my 2 minutes, culture plays a critical role in delivering the strategy. So this is more than just leadership behaviors. This is actually a commercial output. So as you've got windows of opportunity compressing, culture those with a unified culture are better at information sharing. They're better at problem solving. They're better at innovation. They're better at reducing operational drag. It gives organizations integrated customer focal points. So that, the customer journey that people go through, culture coalesces and brings that all together. It aligns tactical actions with the strategy. So that gives you agility and autonomy, so you can be a lot quicker and a lot faster at how you deal with problems, and it helps balance risk taking. So if you take all of those things together, I think you can't see culture as a reaction to upskilling leaders. It's actually a proactive tool. It's actually one of the most important tools that you've got to connect with your customers, with your stakeholders, with your investors, with the communities you work within, as well as your employees.
Thanks, Gavin. So, Imogen, your view before we throw this open. HR focusing on upskilling leaders, does culture take care of itself?
Yes, I'd agree with both points, actually. Sorry, quite boringly. I think, both right. So in terms of, Ben, your comments there about mirror neurons, really, really interesting stuff. Obviously, my background is psychology, and I've kind of used that throughout my HR career. But we need to be talking about, understanding behavior more when we're talking about creating or maintaining or driving, to a new culture or cultural change. And Gavin, in terms of the customer focus, I think sometimes, in my experience, this has been missing, so we go navel gazing and really internal, and look at, quite rightly, at our people. And I've sometimes oversimplified, my definition of culture being the sum of all behaviors, but we know it's not. It is very complex. And it actually absolutely, as you say, has to have that customer focus in terms of the audience. My view, I think, in terms of looking at this question, it's similar, isn't it, to the saying, if you look after culture, strategy takes care of itself. You could unpeel that then to, if you get leadership right, culture looks after itself. I suppose my opinion is that I would agree that cultural tone is set at the top, and that goes back to what Ben was saying about it's what we see. And we know this for those who are parents, it's not what you say, it's what they see, unfortunately. But I do think also that it's not curated necessarily, and it's not something that, leaders, as an ex-leader, as an ex-executive, I felt accountable. And I wanted all of the other execs to feel accountable for the culture, because we do have that influence, and we do need to set that cultural tone. However, I also feel that culture just is, culture is a cyclical kind of moving beast. It's not something that is, as I say, created and just set from the top and top down. I think the leading influence is leadership, but I would also say, so is obviously, as Gavin was saying, strategic direction and creating that optimum working environment, and how they treat people is absolutely seen and emulated. But I think sometimes as well, thinking about my experience of cultural change, or just, working as part of an executive team, we need to also focus on management. So, we may set the cultural tone as leaders of the organisation, but the managers are the curators of the culture. If we want it to work, we absolutely have to have everyone on board, top down and bottom up. It's kind of a cyclical relationship, because as we know from many change programs that we've all been involved in, people make it effective or not.
Thank you. So different points of view, although you I think you agree quite nicely. This first sort of follow-on question resonates a lot with anyone, I think, who's been through a lot of cultural transformation as an employee. Company culture can get trashed with every set of redundancies or TUPE or merger, big organizational change, basically. So the person that posed this question said, is it even safe, I should say, to advertise it? Should we just keep it quiet and see what happens? I'll throw that one out. Imogen,
I take
go for
that
it.
from an HR perspective, because I felt my blood pressure raised when I saw this question. Well, no. So my view is no, we shouldn't, of course, keep quiet about culture, because it exists anyway. If we keep quiet about it, it doesn't make it go away, and it makes people suspicious, and you disengage them. So I've got lots more to say on this subject, but I'll throw it out to Gavin and Ben.
No, I was going to follow up on that. And funnily enough, I'd written something quite similar. But I don't think you can keep it quiet. I think we're in the age of transparency and visibility. People can go online and they can see managers rated a bit like Airbnb or Amazon sellers, pick their own rating. So the idea that you can keep it quiet is that ship has sailed. So there's so much information already out there that it's, I think, pointless to think it is something you just sort of hide a little bit. I think you need to look at another way, which is culture can become a way of mitigating the risk of bad news. In fact, you can actually twist or utilize culture and say, well, all organizations go through some crappy times, just the nature of business, right? Culture can actually be a really effective tool to allow either reduce the risk or reframe the narrative. Because if you don't, you can be sure someone else does.
Yes, you're absolutely right. sorry, just say on that, and from a redundancy perspective, Gavin, sorry, Ben, is if actually you've done the work on your culture first.
Yeah.
I mean, dare I say, it actually makes things like redundancy programs easier. They're never easy. But, you know, in terms of, so the question is redundancies, 2Ps and mergers. I'd say from a, you know, just focusing, I suppose, on redundancies at the moment, they're never, you know, a nice thing to do. And obviously I'm thinking from an HR perspective, but done the right way, don't need to damage the culture. And obviously on the flip side of that, done badly, yes, can absolutely damage what Ben was saying before in terms of mirror neurons. You know, are you walking the walk, and are you treating people the way in which, you know, we state in our values and our culture? And if that's no, then it's seen. Yeah.
I'm fascinated by all the points so far. I wanted to pick up on one thing just that you mentioned, Imogen, and I think, Gavin, you probably sort of referenced as well, which is just this idea around absolutely, you know, leadership not just being the team at the top where everything sort of trickles down, but leadership being something for everyone in the organization, and actually everyone has some effect. You know, it's not necessarily that we just need, when we talk about upskilling leaders, it's just about the sort of top team or that, and making this, you know, distinction between managers and leaders. I personally will get nervous when we actually start to make that, because actually, you know, maybe we're driving or expecting sort of different behaviors. Of course, there's sort of different tasks that people need to do at different perhaps levels of the hierarchy. And coming back to your follow-up question, Simon, on, you know, redundancies and company culture, and should we, you know, advertise it? I'm always a bit skeptical about any company that really shouts from the rooftops about their culture. You know, whether that's Netflix or BrewDog, and you saw the scandal, you know, recently, or even Apple and Google now, right? Who have historically perhaps had this, you know, amazing culture, that Googlers and the hats, and, you know, videos about it, and just everyone wanted to work there, and they use that as a huge tool. You know, now they're in huge fights with all their workforce about how many days in the office they're going to be a week. And I think what it comes down to is the problem of doing things to people. You mentioned that, and redundancies and mergers and all of these things are things we're doing to people, right? Like, and I think this is a really interesting thing. You know, they're obviously very, very difficult decisions that, whether it's senior management or you know, leadership or a leader or HR have to make around, you know, how do we get through a difficult time, or how do we navigate a recession, or, you know, cutting sales or difficult market conditions, whatever it is that's forcing, you know, that situation around redundancy. Because actually, redundancy doesn't have to be the only answer. I think sometimes we get locked in this sort of mindset, actually, that, you know, as a leader, I've got to take responsibility. I can't share that how bad the information is necessarily. I can't let other people come up with this, when there have been one or two examples that kind of go against that. So Semco in Brazil, and Ricardo Semler is sort of a fairly infamous, you know, figure in books like Brave New Work, and looking at different ways of organizing. Well, you know, they literally stood up and said, huge recession in Brazil, you know, and this is not just some tech startup with some sort of holacracy structure. You know, this was 20 years ago in Brazil, but they stood up and said, look, we've got this huge crippling recession. What are we going to do about it? You know, we're going to have to let some people go. And, you know, our current policy is whatever, last one in, first one out, all of that sort of thing. Well, actually, you know, teams took it upon themselves to volunteer a 30% pay cut, to volunteer to go and clean the bathrooms and remove all their external spend. And within a year, they're back to profitability. And sort of crucially, though, with that, they're, you know, actually weren't out of pocket, because they had this profit share scheme, which actually meant that, you know, their return to business performance meant, you know, the sacrifices that those people made. And you know, they talk about kind of culture being a mitigator of these types of situations. Well, that is a brilliant example. But you're right, like that cultural, you know, work, you have to have people feeling like they're part of belonging to something, and feeling like they're in charge of making those decisions, not having stuff done to them. And I think that's the problem with mergers as well, right? Like, is you get this stuff done to people. And I get that in big corporates, you're going to have a strategy team and an M&A team that have to go out and identify the targets, and that's their specialty. And, you know, maybe you can't share information because, you know, it's going to affect the market price. It's going to, you know, there's confidentiality rules in place. But how much work have they really done with the teams who are going to have to interact with them on a day-to-day basis to define, you know, how they're going to work together? And so most mergers, you know, fail to realize the you know, the synergies or whatever you want to call it, you know, the benefits of the merger. I think because they just dumped on them, in my experience. Accenture was a classic case in this. You know, they bought up loads of digital agencies and businesses, and they just said, go and work together. These people were like, well,
isn't that sort of reflective of a wider
decision.
trend, Ben? Isn't that like, because I see this, and I totally agree with your points, but that seems like, you know, the traditional management style of command and control and compliance, right? You know, this is what we're doing, this is where we're going. You will, you know, I've used this phrase beforehand, fix yourselves to fit in when it comes to values and culture, and you will comply. And all of our processes are about compliance and how many holidays have you got, blah, blah, blah. And I think that's your point, which is if we take this very top-down unilateral approach, it kind of blows up because culture is not top-down. Culture is multi-directional, bottom up, left and right, diagonally, you name it. It's about how things work around here. And so if you take just one perspective of it and think you can control it that way, it doesn't work, because culture can't be controlled. It can be shaped, but it can't be controlled.
Yeah, I agree. I love that. That concept, Ben, you were saying there in terms of, you know, kind of power to the people, isn't it? And
it is a little bit.
And it reminded me of, from a non-political perspective, but it reminded me of consultation, you know. So it's kind of, how do you take then the consultation? Sorry, I don't want to go on about HR processes here, but, you know, for those in the audience, you know, from an HR background, it's how to then really reflect your culture. I think you said this, Gavin, didn't you, in terms of how you then consult. So yes, it can sometimes feel, can't it, with redundancies, that it is top down. So how can we do that differently as HR professionals? I think that's a podcast in itself. And then what you were saying there about mergers, Ben. I suppose on reflection, thinking about this and listening to you now, where I think I've potentially gone wrong in the various mergers I've been part of, is that, you know, they take a long time, don't they? You know, so most of the time, most of them do. So as you're going through and your focus then is on that M&A activity and all the due diligence and all of the administration around it, you sometimes neglect your culture. And it's so important, I think, you know, isn't it? I think you both just said that you understand that cultural identity of, if you're merging with another organization, you know what, you know, you need to protect, you know what you need to maintain. You then get to understand the new, you know, other companies culture to create the optimum state. It's not about, so you're here to integrate with our culture, and that's what it has been in some of the experience I've gone through.
Absolutely.
Thank you, guys.
You make me so nervous when you just, sorry, you make me so nervous when you just say the word consultation. It gives me shudders. I know.
It's just let's go.
I'm gonna whisk us on to question 2, as otherwise we'll never move on. So I'm gonna start with you, Gavin. How do you enable culture and engagement to work in our new hybrid world?
Right. Well, the first thing I think is to define hybrid. So I just taking a step back. I think we're all used to the office, and therefore the cultural engagement initiatives that have been customized and tailored to the office environment. I think the next thing is remote. And remote is organizational structure really where everyone is in their own place. There is no central office, so everyone is relatively independent geographically. And then the third one is hybrid, and it is a combination of home and remote and another dimension, which is third place. And here I'm talking about hotels or co-working spaces or cafes, anywhere where colleagues are working together face to face, outside of the office or outside of their home. And I think what we see, if I just think about the question, is hybrid requires us to come up with new interventions that not only work in each of those 3 dimensions, which is more complicated than what we've had beforehand, but also it flows between them, because people flow between them. So you might have someone who works from home on a Monday and a Friday. They might come into the office Tuesday, Wednesday. They might be at a hotel doing their strategy session with their team on a Thursday. We've got to make sure that we think about how culture and engagement flows between all of those locations. Now, I think what we've done in our lurch towards hybrid that's been precipitated by the pandemic but was already there, was that we've used a lot of different, or we've used a lot of different approaches to it. And I think that we've borrowed quite heavily from the remote world. And there are some brilliant ideas that have come out from the remote world. I'm thinking of companies like Hogsby, where Brad and I work at, as well as GitLab, who've come up with these great processes to enable people to work. But I don't think that's the end point. And but if you take the same premise that if office first interventions don't work for remote workers, why would remote first interventions work for office workers? I mean, it feels like a truism for me. And so you've got to kind of reinvent from the ground up. And I think that's probably my main point, is that when you're looking at culture and engagement for the hybrid workforce, it's not, you can't borrow from Peter to pay Paul. You can't sort of start with one area at the expense of someone else's dimension. And I think that's very individual for each organization. I think it has to be very much tailored to that, where that organization is at what inflection point. But there are three core bits that I would call out of it that I've seen in my experience working with my clients. First off, got to create these new emotional and social connections between everyone. And we're talking about building relationships. I see the emotional and social connections as the bedrock of innovation, of collaboration, of all of the things, all the magical things that happen in an organization. And but you don't have that, because that's dramatically reduced when everyone's out of the office, then you've got to kind of come up with different ways to enable that to happen, no matter where people are. I think the second thing is about improving the visibility of leaders and accessibility. And here is my key thing here is about role modeling. So leadership, how culture permeates an organization has been through role modeling and keeping the right standards. What I think we lose or have lost is the ability to for people to see indirectly leaders role model the right behaviors and the right standards of behavior. And so you've got to kind of come up with a new solution that really focuses on giving that visibility and making sure that that information can be shared very easily and equitably across the business. And the final piece, and I've talked about this beforehand, is about flowing between the three different dimensions. Here, the point I'm making is, it's not about making it the same, it's about making it equitable. I think it's unrealistic to say you can have an identical process in the office as you can for remote workers, but you can have something that's equitable, that gives someone the same experience and the same emotional connection that comes out of it, even if it's tailored for the environment that they're in.
Thank you, Gavin. Imogen, how do you enable culture and engagement to work in the new hybrid world?
And again, I agree with Gavin. And I think just to, from my perspective, and obviously I'm coming from an HR perspective, I find we have a great opportunity here to redefine, and thinking of all those conversations I had about hybrid working and flexible working and what have you, that ship has now sailed, hasn't it? I'd say that, culture isn't contained within the walls of any office. I think to realise the effect, though, of people not working together is something that we need to really reflect on now. And this is new to everybody. So it's not something, going back to what you said there, you can't rob Peter to pay Paul. It's not, they've done that and let's try this. But there is maybe a period of reflection and review to experiment with what does work. And I think my current thoughts on this, because they do change all the time, because it's forever moving, is that I'm going back to my really oversimplified, if the definition of culture, if it's the sum of all behaviours, and now we're working potentially more, most organisations more independently or at home and interacting less. If group behaviours shape the culture, are we now becoming a sum of independent behaviours? I don't know. So I think I've heard contrary to hybrid working being good for culture, or what the potential pitfalls could be. I was at a conference last week for the board members, and they said, well, of course, you can't be creative, and innovation really is going to die out because we're not working together. In terms of, I don't have an opinion on this. because I don't know. I think it depends on the individual. We're thinking more of from a diversity of thought perspective. There are people with a more of a introverted personality that might absolutely thrive creatively working from home. It depends what your job is. It depends what the culture of your organization is. So I wouldn't really be as bold to say what I think, in terms of innovation and creation or creativity, being a pitfall of hybrid working. But in terms of making it work, and I think what is clear is there's no getting back to normal. It's redefining what that normal is, as Gavin was saying, and rethinking really what you go into the office for. And it's not my own, but I heard it's a McKinsey consultant, quoting, well, working on site is the new off site. And for me, I went, I love that, because, there needs to be a purpose. What is the purpose that you're bringing people together for? And this is the time to really delve into, yes, look externally, but really delve into what is the purpose for your organization to get people together as an event that they couldn't have done at home. Going back to the conference I said I was at last week, we sat there, it was a great conference, guys, but we sat there and listened to people present to us, which we could have done online, and there's a little bit of networking afterwards. We need to really rethink how we do things.
I see you nodding a lot there, Ben.
Yeah, I think that really hits the nail on the head around purpose there, Imogen, and even that networking. You can do lots of that online. So I'm very much coming at this, and Gavin and I have had lots of passionate debates about this. But I am coming at this as fully fledged. I put my colours on the wall or whatever, that I am pro remote working, whatever we call that. And you said, Gavin, we need to define what hybrid means. And I don't think you actually kind of gave a definition, because I don't think everyone's clear. And I think there's a real thing that we need to address here, which is a dilemma. We're not going to be able to resolve this, of one person's right to want all of their team in one place in the office or wherever. You can't have that right and the right for everyone in that team to choose where they work. You just can't have those two things together. One of them has to trump the other. And essentially, I'm going to make the same point I made in the answer to the last question, Simon, but when you do things to people, when you impose your right to want my team in the office on this day of the week, even if it's only one day or 2 days or whatever it is, you are, I think, taking a real risk when it comes to culture and engagement. You're not giving people that autonomy to choose. And Imogen, you're right. The ship sailed, the cat's out of the bag, whatever analogy you want to use. People have experienced this, and the things that you said about does creativity suffer? No. Does innovation suffer? No. Does productivity suffer? No. And I'm talking obviously about the types of jobs which are possible remote. We're not talking about surgery or loading, moving things around a warehouse. Clearly there are some things that you do need to be in person, but for those jobs where you can do it remotely, and you have done it for 2 years remotely, being asked or told in some cases to come back to the office it is imposing on that choice, and there isn't a clear purpose and a clear reason for it. And I think a lot of people also still conflate being remote with being in lockdown. I think what we need to do in order to enable culture and enable engagement is to address the fears that people have. And I think these are just speculation, these are my thoughts, but I think there's a fear of loneliness. People fear not being around people. I think you get a lot of meaning from being with people, and some people are not perhaps tech confident and savvy and comfortable, being on Zoom all day. I like it. I was in person yesterday with a client. Actually, I find that really draining. To be honest, I found there was loads of rubbish small talk, to be perfectly honest. And, I would rather not have that. I'd rather have the value of, the group discussions that you can have in breakout rooms, of the information that you're sharing and presenting, all of that. So I think there's a fear around that. I think there's a fear around the loss of control over people. If you can't see them working, you don't know if they're actually doing anything. And people had, this wonderful thing. They went into this really grandiose office. I don't know if you work for Goldman Sachs or something. I feel really powerful, and all these people are on my floor, all these traders, gives me a huge sense of meaning, huge sense of my identity. And you've lost that. We have to it's a big thing for someone to lose. And there's a lot of people, I think, on the Kubler-Ross curve, or whatever, however you want to accept that people go through change at different paces, that are either at complete denial stage and are just saying, get back to the office, it's going to be the same, or a bargaining stage where they're going, is it 2 days, is it 3 days, is it 4 days, is it core days, is it this? And hey, people have moved, people have up sticks and moved. Like, it's not as easy. And now we're going to go through a summer of train strikes and whatever. It's just going to kind of ram home, I think, that actually, you know, the getting out of the house, going for beers in the city, having this clear authority and deference and all these trappings, which you work for, suddenly you go, well, why am I'm just sat at a laptop. And you could be sat at a laptop working for Goldman Sachs or for Accenture or for Deloitte, or it doesn't matter. Like, now what matters is what you're up to. And that's where the purpose, I think, comes in so importantly. And I think, you know, to improve culture and engagement, which is back to the question, you know, I think there's 3 things that we really have to work on. And one is communication. And I think Hawkesby do this super well, but like really over communicating, because if you accept that, you know, at least some of the time in a hybrid world, you're going to be dispersed, you got to communicate what you're up to. You know, nothing breeds sort of like this, you know, feeling of uncertainty and fear and what are people up to, and oh God, you know, that anxiety, without, you know, you go for a meeting and then, is someone doing that? I can't remember. Like, what did we agree? You know, all of that. So whether that's picking up the phone for 5 minutes, whether that's typing a long message in an email or Slack or Teams or whatever platform it is, whether that is, you know, having certain rituals and things you put in place around communication, there's got to be an increased bar around how we communicate in the workforce. I think, you know, we've got to work on trust. Like, I think that is a really important thing. We've got to help leaders develop trust and see how important that is, and that they can't just use some of the same tools that they were in the office for that, you know, when perhaps people didn't trust that things were getting on. And we've just got to face it, that we've got to get more tech savvy. If you're going to get on in the workplace, like, this has happened, whether that's, you know, effective virtual meetings, whether that's using Slack and online collaboration tools, you know, everyone's at a different stage of what tool set that they use in organizations. And it doesn't have to mean emojis everywhere and like incredibly noisy Slack, but it does have to mean, you know, there are ways to work so much more productively where we collaborate on, you know, Google Docs or whatever shared software, all the way up to, you know, the Miros and the mural boards and the, you know, kind of more whizzy stuff. And that's going to, ultimately, that's, I think, what people are going to choose to do. And that's what's going to drive productivity. So that's where kind of talent's going to go. And so, you know, how do you drive like engagement, you know, across that? Like, I think you got to come up with some new rituals. You've got to come up with some new ways of doing these things, whether that is, you know, at T- we have the roast and toast, which is, you know, you kind of like toast some people and you roast some people, you know, you like try and make it like kind of fun around it. Hawkesby, there was the Hawkesby hero. I don't think you necessarily have to define these are the things that you need, but everyone can come up with that for themselves. But you do need to find ways of interacting with each other. I mean, my favorite one, Imogen, you mentioned it there, like, get together. I'm trying to push for this absolutely with T-. It's get together once a month for a day, you know, in a Tuscan villa, whatever it is, like, put all of that budget, that $8,000 a month we were spending on the office, into that one day experience. You know, I'm not saying we need to do any work. Like, we can do all the work, that's fine, like any day, but get together, create some memories, shared experience together. And if we, you know, want to have a fun brainstorming session about a new problem, great. Like, but come up with the rituals that work for you and your team. Let's not have any more, you know, mandated things, because I know in insurance, so with an insurance client yesterday, you know, different teams ignore it. They've mandated it, and there are teams openly accepting that they just ignore these new mandates now, and they should do.
So on a practical level then, for the HR audience, so we've touched on this. A lot of businesses have what's been described as two-tier workforce. So the office worker, the non-office worker who must be present delivering services. How do we drive engagement and culture with those two different or many different types of employee group? Because that's more of a challenge, isn't it? And it particularly lands with HR. I'll stay with you, Ben, because that's the structure I'm going to follow. But just to pass that one round, what are your thoughts?
This is well, because I struggle with. I'm probably less in the world of the practicalities, and my first instinct is just to challenge the distinctive nature between office and non-office workers. And now I assume, or I would hope, that an office worker has to be in the office for a clear purpose. And if that's not the case, then I would just try and blow the whole thing up. If they're in the office for a clear purpose, I didn't like. It's probably similar to this isn't actually necessarily a new problem. At Accenture, that was a hybrid world where most people are out off at different client sites all around the country, all around the globe, and a few people come together in the core office, often on a Friday, or they come there when they're on the bench. Now, I wasn't in HR, but I can tell you some of the things that happened to me when I was there. Some days out in the field, some days in the office, and there is a consistent approach because firstly, you've got all of the information, access on the portal. You've got the kind of the core training that you've gone through, which is all about ask for help when you need it, help people when you're asked, and this sort of magic secret sauce, they used to call it, of like how people just behave and help each other and access the knowledge exchange, and this underlying sort of platform of that helps everyone. You've got the fact that you're given a laptop that works especially well with PowerPoint, with a particularly useful PowerPoint toolbar that someone's created. You know that it's all about creating slides and excellence sort of for clients, and it's all about that. So that's consistent whether you're in the office sort of or not. So I guess you do have to look at all the touch points along someone's typical journey and make sure that's consistent. But how much do you need to make this distinction? I'm not sure. I'll leave that to Gavin and Imogen to provide more clarity.
Over to
Imogen,
you.
do you want to go next?
Yeah, sorry, what I'm just thinking there, listening to you, Ben, is organizations have to be really careful around this two-tier, don't they? That one, you're not orchestrating subcultures, and subcultures do exist, but that we're not going back to the kind of the feeling, I suppose, that when we're under lockdown, and as you mentioned, Ben, some people have to, can't do their jobs remotely. They have to be physically in the office, and they were the heroes, and we were the slackers working from home. And I think if that manifests, you've got a cultural problem. You've obviously got the impact there in terms of engagement. But I think in general, most people, dare I generalize, are considering every minute they're working, every minute they're then commuting, hopefully not into London at the moment, is one less minute at home in their personal life, family, friends, etc. So, going back to what we were discussing around purpose, the boundaries have been blurred. And from a cultural perspective, if employees, are asking, does this fit my purpose? Is there then that kind of dissonance, being, the divide being broadened, then we've got a cultural problem. I do think that it's interesting you talking about Accenture, talking about, many clients who have been doing this for years. They're a global, large company. What's this? Why are people talking about hybrid like it's this new concept? And how, so learning from experiences of organizations who automatically, have for decades operated in this way. How have they done it? How what can we learn from them? But then how do you tailor that specific approach for your organization?
And just to build on that, sorry, Gavin.
Yeah, go for it.
And just to build on that, Imogen, like I said, we're big investors in getting people together for a day, for a training program, for an event. They have communities, whether that's within sort of your community of practice of the type of skills you're involved in, or an interest group or an industry group. And there were lots of in-person events every quarter, every 6 months, whatever, this type of thing. So there was that, and there's a tech platform behind it, so you can communicate with people, and people do lots of one-to-ones and networking. But being able, that was driven almost by necessity. It was driven by the fact that you have, accept that everyone's going to be out at client sites, so you can't bring people together. And I think accepting that necessity is perhaps an important step that maybe some organizations need to go through. Gavin.
Yeah, well, I agree with the points that have been made, shockingly, but I'm going to sort of go from at a slightly different angle, which is about the pragmatic solution that HR could approach with this, because it is nebulous, it is quite sort of confusing. And I'm going to totally plagiarize a professor from Boston Business School, because I think he really nailed it. So, but before I do that, I just want to go back a step and differentiate the difference between culture and engagement, because I think this is a huge thing that gets missed in a lot of these debates, which is really confusing. If we, I think, Imogen, you said earlier on about the consistent understanding across the organization. We just don't have that as a on this topic, which is quite abstract, it's quite nebulous. There is a lot of inconsistency, and that leads to a lot of confusion, which leads to a lot of badly spent time or misdirected time. So look, I'll stop waffling, I'll get to the point. Culture is a system of values and beliefs that connects everyone. It's how things work around here. It's how an organization works with each other. Engagement is importantly different in that it is how an individual feels about how things work around here. So they're two sides of the same coin, but they are different sides of the same coin. Right. So when we talk about engagement, what practically can you do? And this is where I plagiarize from Professor Bill Kahn, who did a load of work on employee engagement going back to the early 90s. And his point was employee engagement lives in those small interactions that happen with their leaders, within teams and between teams. And he argued that it fell to leaders to really inculcate, to really nurture that level of engagement at a really pragmatic, tactical level, where workers felt unreservedly at home, and I use that in a metaphorical sense as opposed to the literal sense, but they felt at home in the organization no matter where they were, irrespective of whether in the office, at home, at a third place, whatever that might be. So for me, it's about really doubling down on what are the competencies and capabilities of our leaders, right? Do we have the right competencies and capabilities that are about inculcating that sense of belonging? Do we train and coach our leaders up to be able to do that? And do we set the right standards? Do we help them set the right standards throughout the organization? So for me, all of this pivots at a practical level around leaders. And that's not just at the top end, that's throughout the organization, about displaying the right behaviors. How do you drive psychological safety? How do you have those rituals and customs, Ben, that you mentioned earlier on? How do you distribute decision making so people feel that they're part of the organization? If you get that right, I think you can get it to work effectively regardless of the location of the worker.
Can I just comment on, you're the first person to mention psychological safety, and it's a bit of an aha moment. Absolutely. I think in terms of talking to an audience that's potentially, HR focused, if only, in terms of reflections of cultural change programs, D&I programs, you name it, I had focused more on psychological safety and that foundation before I embarked on the change.
Yeah, you have to. Yeah, totally agree. Totally agree. But there's other things beyond psychological safety, which I'm not going to go into now because we'll be here for a very long
podcast.
This is it. Well, and I'm really conscious. There's an awful lot more I know you all want to say on this topic, but unfortunately we are overrunning a little, so I'm going to steer us towards the final destination for today, which is how does HR get everyone to understand what culture is and what it takes to deliver real value? And I'm going to start with you, Imogen, as obviously an HR director, as was. Over to you.
In short, easily? No, obviously not. I do think, so how I'm going to just shape this answer really is, seeing HR professionals as cultural architects. And any of the questions that were posed that you collated, Gavin, in terms of how do HR get people to, and they don't, we don't get people to, do we? But what can we do? We can educate, initially, and obviously engage, we can facilitate, we can influence. So in terms of whether that is, starting, which was always been my start point in terms of defining what the culture is, what is that current state? It's why I always weigh myself before every diet, where are you starting from? And it's being in HR, being that cultural agent. In terms of leading the change, I have said previously, and we've talked about leadership quite a lot in terms of leadership, whatever that is, having, setting that cultural tone. I would also argue, of course, that HR professionals as change agents or cultural architects, whatever you want to call it, do also set that standard, set that tone, and to really create the process. Sometimes it's such a complex thing, isn't it? Creating, a structure around it, in my experience, has been some of the value that I or my team have been able to provide. And I think the crux of the question here is, I'm just going back to the question, sorry, in terms of understanding what culture is. Spend that time. You just mentioned there, Gavin, about psychological safety. Create the right environment. Create those foundations before you embark on trying to understand what the culture is and going through any kind of change program. I have always, as I said, as an HR director for the last 20 years, I've been through a few cultural change programs. And as always, you learn more from your failures or, in terms of what you think you could have improved on when you reflect. I have always started with the definition of. And when I say I've started, I've tended to ensure that we involve everybody. So whether this means the whole, depending on how large your organisation is, obviously the whole organisation, or people who are interested and volunteer to be those champions or whatever kind of accolades you want to give them. So in terms of defining what culture is, it's defined by the people. As lovely as we consultants are with our magic wands and our brilliant theories, they all help, but it really needs to be defined, and it feel kind of bottom up. But as you said before, Gavin, there is no linear relationship with culture. I think it's more cyclical, isn't it? So identifying what that cultural identity is, and I've also found it really value add, really, creating a common language. Sometimes articulating what a culture is has been the hardest part. So you can always go through a change program and think, right, from a project management perspective, this is what we're doing and this is the program of events. But really on being able to articulate and define what the company culture is, I found really interesting at every organisation. You don't get everyone to agree, and what you don't want, you need to move them on as facilitators to make sure that we're not wordsmithing, for weeks on end. But in terms of then what it is, what really serves the strategy and serves the purpose of the organisation, and obviously is aligned to the business plan. What do we need to maintain? So what is it? I think you said secret sauce at Accenture, Ben. So what is it that needs to be maintained, and what potentially, from looking at that current state, does need to potentially change with the times and with the strategy? So what I've done in the past again is then looked at what the desired state is, and then you can easily create a structure around what that kind of gap analysis is to create that tailored plan. When you're working with people, this is not an easy exercise, so I've done it before, which I'm sure a lot of the audience have, where you bring in consultants and you literally outsource it. I've done it where I've tried to create this kind of organic process which is owned by the people and just facilitated and more light touch by HR, because I've never wanted it to feel as though it's HR doing culture. So in terms of making it, going back to what you're saying there, Gavin, in terms of customer focus, a customer has to be, a part and a main focus of what your culture is, because it has to be aligned to the strategy and business needs. It's not a peripheral HR conversation anymore. This is absolutely integral to the success of the organisation. So in short, trying to wrap it up there, I think that, it does start with engagement, of course, laying the right foundations. In terms of education, I'm a fan, in my experience, of nudge theory. That big block down here, you're all going to learn, and I'm going to make it mandatory and put it on your governance training. No, it hasn't always worked, but that more nudge theory, and I found there's lots of lots of research on this, but little and often on a daily basis within a 3-week optimum time period before they get bored. How do you really engage people in terms of what the culture is? I found on that little and often has worked better, but giving what potentially does feel potentially top down is giving the clarity, that clear line of sight. Where does culture fit in? So when we've done target operating models before, I've put it into, sometimes sandwiched it into people. I've created, as a circular cyclical thing, that culture is around all of this. It has to be a concept that everybody understands and buys into. And then lastly, I'd just say that I'm going to say this from an HR perspective, and for those in the audience, it's ensuring that the culture is then embedded within all of the infrastructure of the organization. So really thinking about how people are treated, how people treat each other, how their performance is measured, how are they developed and why, and going into just obviously how they're recognized and rewarded, from who you attract, how you bring them in and board them, to how they're exited. The whole life cycle has to be the culture has to be felt throughout it. And then I'd say also the main crux of it, in terms of getting back to the question, and how do you get to, everyone to understand what culture is? Involve them, ask them, and listen, I'd say.
Thanks, Imogen. A lot to pick apart there, gentlemen. Ben, I guess I'll continue my route around the screen. Your views.
Yeah, I don't know if I'm the best qualified person to, and how practical information you'll get from me, but I can share some bits of my experience and hopefully some useful questions or something maybe to think about. I think the first thing, and we've mentioned it a bit, and I get a bit nervous as not an HR practitioner, not really an expert, perhaps always even on culture, is you've got to be really careful we're not asking these like navel gazing questions. So, how does HR get everyone to understand what culture is? Like, feels like a lot of effort for what? Like, I think it's got to be so focused on business value. If HR exists as a separate entity in the first place, which I'd argue, and there are some organizations where it doesn't, right? This is, if you draw a circle, culture and people responsibility is everyone's responsibility in an organization. I'd almost argue that. But I think the answer around getting it to deliver value is perhaps two things, or two areas. And one is helping, people tap into the intrinsic motivators of people. Unlocking the discretionary effort of people is where business value sits from doing all people stuff, and that is their passions, their strengths, getting people to understand those, getting people to find job craft their roles into ways that they can contribute more, frankly, kind of in an organization, and then also the impact that they have, the second thing, on other people, so how they build relationships, how they interact, whether that's with customers, with other stakeholders, or with each other, sort of within teams. I think ultimately, with HR and getting it to deliver value, you need to get people to accept that, accept responsibility for their impacts on others and for their impacts on that they're having in the business, rather than retreating behind the sort of cultural excuse of that's just the way things are done around here. I can't change that. I think the biggest problem, speaking to people I know, just friends in the NHS, is you get this constant apathy, this constant I can't change the system. It's the culture of the NHS, and it's like you've got I think the thing to do is to try and get people to tap into this feeling of I can, the self-efficacy of people to do that. And the challenge as well around culture is how do you prove causation? How do you measure the impact? They're difficult, nebulous things sometimes to measure. It's perhaps always on the important list, not on the urgent list. So deep down, do people really? I think deep down people do know this stuff is really important. Deep down, how we spend our time at work is a huge proportion of how we spend our lives. Do we want it to be drudgery? Do we want it to be in a culture where we feel like we have to park our passion, our enthusiasm, and our motivation at the door? Or do we want to be part of something and part of a wonderful, exciting culture, and tapping into that of people, see what people, there's a lot of strengths-based stuff out there that I think is really, really powerful. Like starting there, understanding what it is that ignites people, just finding ways to try and bring more of that into the organization. Really important. So, if you were going to boil it down, it's almost the Aristotle quote of know thyself, and like, how do you help everyone do that? From both the sense of themselves, of what they're bringing and how they're contributing, but also the impact, I guess, that they're having on other people, and then whether you have a central team that does that, whether you empower a team to do that, whether that's just everyone's role, I don't know. I don't know what the best way of necessarily doing that is. I'd leave that to Gavin and Imogen, but certainly creating an environment, that people feel so empowered to do that they take the responsibility and feel the self-efficacy around that is really important.
Thanks, Ben. Gavin.
Some really excellent points there. I love the Aristotle quote, Ben, and I think that's absolutely right. And Imogen, I completely agree with you in the sort of the clarification. So I'm not going to repeat what other people have said. I'm hopefully going to add to it. And again, I'm going to try and take a bit more of a pragmatic, practical approach to this. Totally agree, Imogen, with your point that there's a lot of inconsistency. You know, we use different definitions for culture. Well, we say culture and engagement interchangeably when we mean this, we almost meaning the same thing. We have different approaches, right? So some organizations have a multi-year approach to culture. Some see it as a finite project that lasts 6 months and then it's off the to-do list and then I move on. And then we have completely different responsibilities. HR could be people and culture, or it's HR generalist. It could be the CEO's job. It could be given to the COO. I mean, it is obviously individual for each individual organization to figure out, but there is so much inconsistency around there that I get why people are struggling. So for me, back to your point, Imogen, there is the opportunity to drive a level of consistency, consistent terminology, you know, consistent examples of how culture actually works in your organization. So break it into these bite-sized chunks and say, well, this is what culture is. Consistent, accurate measurement. And I think, Ben, I mean, you wonderfully sidestepped this one, but I think there is we measure culture completely differently in lots of different organizations. And we end up actually, my view, we don't measure culture. We don't actually measure engagement. We are not, as an industry, we're not very good at this. So I think there's an opportunity there to be much more consistent in how we measure culture, actually measuring culture as opposed to engagement or attrition or whatever it might be. And then you've got to define that accountability. Just be clear on who does what and where. Now, again, that's quite nebulous, but I think, you know, I use the phrase, you know, you've got the C-suite that are the owners, you've got HR that are the stewards, and then you've got everyone else who is responsible for nurturing the culture. There is a level of, I suppose, the next layer of granularity down that helps sort of guide people. And then my final bit, I'm going to say this, is about what it takes to deliver real value. The bit to really hammer home for me is culture is not the end point. And I think, Ben, you said this and Imogen, you said this. Culture is a means to an end. Culture enables your business success. And so you've got to really figure out what is the unmet need that in your organization that culture can help address. How will it solve that particular problem? So how does moving the dial on culture enable you to either increase customer centricity? How does it improve your digitalization process? How does it improve agility? And then you've got to get down into what are the actual tangible changes you're going to make and how are you going to measure them? And so it's easy to say that, it's harder to do that. But I think if we are talking about change, you've actually got to link it to the value that you're generating through the intervention. And that's not we're creating a great new culture. It's we are delivering this value for our customers. We're going to be doing this for our business. Culture is the enabler of that. It's not the end point. I've probably run out of time on that one, I think, Simon.
I think we're coming, unless there's any final comments, I did have one kind of free-for-all question I just wanted to throw out there, which links to this, which is taking it almost back to brass tacks from the beginning, really. Does culture define the behaviours or does behaviour define the culture? I've been thinking about this for 2 weeks.
I have a view, but okay, Imogen had a big intake of breath there,
well,
so I was about to take a step back.
Heavy breathing, sorry. If I had to hang my, I would say that behaviours drive culture, because I think that I'm a little bit set, and maybe guys, you can change my mind on this, of that oversimplification, because we know it is, that it's the sum of all behaviours, it's a group behaviour or sum of all individual behaviours. So my opinion is that behaviours drive culture.
Shall I go next? So my pithy and rather vague answer is both. But let me explain what I mean by that. I think you can do both. They're absolutely in a symbiotic relationship. And I agree, Imogen, that in an ideal world, if you are starting from scratch, you would say, okay, let's, we have our purpose. Values become the guides that define what we do, or the guideposts as we're trying to deliver our purpose. That defines the behaviors define the culture. So I totally agree with that. But so that's a prospective way But you could do a retrospective way as well. So you might have a successful organization that has been successful because of the behaviors. And so you might look at your behaviors and go, well, okay, what's worked for us? What are the behaviors that have been really powerful for our organization that's enabled our success? Let's extrapolate out our culture from that. So how do we build upon what we've already got? So I think it's a horrible answer, and I apologize to the person that asked it, but it depends where you are, where your organization is, at what inflection point they're at. You could do a retrospective or you could do a prospective.
I think I'll go with my earlier pithy line of first we shape our buildings, then our buildings shape us. So, you know, without an organization, like you're saying at the start, of course, the behaviors shape it. And then afterwards, you know, stuff builds up around it, whether that is, you know, a result of just learnt behavior, a result of a new process, or an operating system, or the tools and technology people have chosen to use, or whatever it is. Then there's other stuff that will shape culture. And, you know, it's not that every individual has the same impact. Like there are, whether they're cultural angels or just influential people or just senior leaders who've been around a long time, you know, different people will have different sized sort of ripple effects. And so, yes, I think you do need to kind of watch out or identify or use or be aware of those types of people. But depending where you are on your journey, you know, the behavior is ultimately, I think, such an important thing when it comes to culture that it almost is everything.
Thank you all. Hey, I'm really conscious that we've all got so much more to say around these areas, but time has flown, and we want to make this something that people can digest. But if I can just take a moment to say thanks to Imogen, thanks to Ben, thanks to Gavin for joining, and also thanks to Gavin, who has very much helped an awful lot with the architecture of this conversation today and the planning. What we'll do from here, as I said, we'll communicate this out. There's a lot more to discuss on these 3 question areas. So if you would like to interact with Gavin, Ben and Imogen, we can make that happen. So I'll contact you all via email, via the usual socials, and you know, explain that route. And basically, thank you for listening. Thank you guys for giving up your valuable time.
Thanks very much. It's been a fun debate.
Thanks very much.
Thanks, guys.
Thanks very much for organising. It's been fantastic.
Yeah.
Really enjoyed it.
Thanks for joining. Cheers. Bye-bye now.
Bye.